Imagine a war that didn't begin with bombs, but with signatures, not with tanks, but with silence. Before the world burned in 1939, it was slowly suffocating for 21 years. A defeated nation was humiliated. Economies were crushed. Fear replaced courage, and the most dangerous weapon of all was unleashed. Hope mixed with anger. While leaders promised peace, they fed the fire. While the world looked away, history was being rewritten. This is not the story of how World War II started. This is the story of how it was allowed to start. Stay with me, because once you see the real beginning, you'll never look at 1939 the same way again. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. In the fields of France, the mud still carried the echoes of dying men. The air still tasted of smoke, blood, and shattered dreams. The Great War had ended, but it had not healed. Instead, it left behind a wounded world limping toward a future it did not understand. Soldiers returned home, not as victors, but as broken survivors. Mothers waited at empty doorways. Fathers stared at photographs of sons who would never come back. Cities rebuilt their walls, but the cracks in the human spirit ran far deeper than any bombed building. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to secure peace. But instead of closing the book on war, it planted the seeds of another. Germany was humiliated, punished, and stripped of pride. The nation was forced to accept full blame for a war it did not fight alone. Its military was crippled, its economy strangled, its people reduced to despair. And in that despair, resentment was born. In the ruined streets of Berlin, children begged for bread. Workers lined up for hours, only to be told there was nothing left. Inflation devoured savings, turning hard-earned money into worthless paper. Families burned cash to stay warm because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Across Europe, politicians spoke of peace, but whispered in fear. Empires had collapsed. Borders were redrawn. Old powers like Austria-Hungary vanished, replaced by fragile new nations that trembled at the slightest threat. The world was unstable, like a wounded animal ready to strike. Then came the 1920s, a deceptive era of glitter and music. Jazz played in American clubs, flappers danced, and champagne flowed. But beneath the surface, the foundation of the world was cracking. The prosperity was an illusion, a fragile glass bridge over a deep, dark abyss. In 1929, that bridge shattered. The Great Depression swept across the globe like a cold, merciless storm. Banks collapsed, factories shut down, millions lost their jobs, their homes, their hope. In the United States, men sold apples on street corners just to survive. In Europe, desperation turned into anger, and anger turned into radicalism. And in Germany, a man stepped into that storm. Adolf Hitler did not rise to power on violence alone. He rose on broken promises, wounded pride, and exploited suffering. He spoke not just to crowds, but to their pain. He promised them greatness, revenge, and a rebirth of German power. And slowly, the broken nation began to listen. Meanwhile, the world watched and did nothing. Britain and France, scarred by the horrors of World War I, chose appeasement. They believed that if they gave Hitler small victories, he would be satisfied. They allowed him to remilitarize the Rhineland. They watched as he annexed Austria in 1938 and still remained silent. Then came Munich. European leaders shook hands with Hitler, believing they had secured peace. Neville Chamberlain returned to Britain, declaring peace in our time. But behind that smile, history was already writing its tragedy. In the shadows, Hitler was preparing for conquest. His ambitions were never limited to small territories. They stretched across Europe from Paris to Moscow. On September 1st, 1939, the world awoke to the sound of explosions. German planes roared over Poland, dropping bombs on sleeping cities. Tanks rolled across borders like iron beasts. Sirens wailed. Families ran for shelter. Children clutched their mothers in terror. And in that moment, the world realized a terrible truth. World War II did not begin with a single gunshot in 1939. It began in 1918 in the bitterness of a defeated nation. It grew through economic collapse, political cowardice, and human desperation. It was shaped by broken treaties, shattered economies, and the darkness that lives inside human ambition. The war was not just fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought with words, lies, fear, and ideology. It was born in suffering, and it would drown the world in blood. As we look back today, we must remember, wars do not start overnight. They are built slowly, silently, and dangerously through injustice, humiliation, and unchecked power. The story of 1918 to 1939 is not just history. It is a warning, a reminder that peace is fragile and that the cost of ignoring suffering is often paid in millions of lives. And as the smoke of history drifts across time, we are left with one haunting question. If the world had acted differently, could World War II have been stopped? In 1919, when the delegates gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the war had already carved itself into the bones of Europe. The chandeliers glittered above polished floors. But outside those walls lay a continent of graves, ruined villages, and men who could no longer sleep without hearing artillery in their dreams. The Treaty of Versailles was presented as justice, as closure, as the final act that would ensure such destruction would never return. Yet for Germany, it felt less like peace and more like a public execution carried out with pens instead of rifles. The nation was not invited as an equal partner to negotiate its future. It was summoned to accept guilt, punishment, and shame. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, placed the full moral and legal responsibility for the war squarely on Germany's shoulders, ignoring the tangled web of alliances, mobilizations, and imperial ambitions that had dragged all of Europe into catastrophe. To the German people, this was not an abstract legal statement. It was a declaration that their sons had died for nothing, that their suffering was meaningless, that they alone were the villains of history. Veterans returned home to find themselves branded not as heroes, but as symbols of disgrace. Many had lost limbs, friends, and years of their lives, only to be told that their country deserved humiliation. The treaty stripped Germany of territory it had held for generations. Alsace-Lorraine was handed back to France. The Polish corridor sliced through German land, separating East Prussia from the rest of the country. And millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves living under foreign flags. These were not just lines on a map. They were families divided, identities erased, and communities forced to redefine who they were overnight. The military restrictions cut even deeper into national pride. Germany's army was reduced to a token force of 100,000 men, forbidden from using tanks, aircraft, or submarines. The Navy was reduced to a shadow of its former self, and the Rhineland was demilitarized, leaving Germany feeling naked and exposed. For a society that had once defined itself through discipline, order, and military strength, this was psychological disarmament as much as physical. The treaty told Germany not only that it had lost the war, but that it could never again be trusted to defend itself. Then came the reparations. The figures were so vast that they seemed unreal, yet they were enforced with relentless seriousness. Germany was ordered to pay billions of gold marks to the Allied powers, a sum that crippled the economy before it could even begin to recover. To meet these demands, the government printed money, and money lost its meaning. By the early 1920s, hyperinflation turned daily life into a nightmare. Workers were paid twice a day so they could rush out and spend their wages before prices doubled again. Children played with stacks of banknotes like toys, Elderly couples who had saved their entire lives found that their savings could no longer buy a loaf of bread. Dignity vanished as people bartered furniture, jewelry, and family heirlooms just to survive. Resentment grew not only toward the foreign powers who had imposed these terms, but toward the new German government that had signed them. The Weimar Republic, fragile and inexperienced, was born in defeat and immediately associated with surrender and weakness. Many Germans believed the army had never truly been defeated on the battlefield, that it had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and civilians at home. This myth of betrayal, whispered in beer halls and printed in nationalist newspapers, became a powerful poison. It allowed people to redirect their pain outward, to believe that their suffering had been imposed by enemies both foreign and domestic. The treaty also reshaped Europe in ways that guaranteed instability. New nations were created in Central and Eastern Europe, but their borders were drawn hastily, often without regard for ethnic, cultural, or historical realities. Minorities were trapped inside states that did not want them, and old rivalries were reborn under new flags. Germany watched as its former imperial rivals retained much of their power while preaching peace and morality. To many Germans, Versailles did not look like justice. It looked like victor's revenge dressed up as law. What made the resentment so dangerous was had it lingered year after year, quietly shaping attitudes and beliefs. Children grew up hearing their parents speak of humiliation and loss. Classrooms taught a version of history that emphasized injustice and betrayal. Veterans organizations became spaces where anger hardened into ideology. The treaty was not a single event confined to 1919. It was a daily presence felt in empty wallets, wounded pride, and a constant sense of being cornered by history. When foreign troops occupied the Ruhr in 1923 to enforce reparations payments, the humiliation became physical. German workers responded with strikes and passive resistance while the government continued printing money to support them, pushing inflation to unimaginable extremes. The occupation deepened the feeling that Germany was a nation under siege, punished not to restore balance but to keep it permanently weak. Each crisis reinforced the belief that the international order was not designed for fairness, but for domination. By the time economic stability briefly returned in the mid-1920s, the emotional damage was already done. The resentment had settled into the collective memory, waiting for someone to give it direction. The Treaty of Versailles had succeeded in ending World War I, but it failed to create reconciliation. It punished a nation without healing a continent, and in doing so, it ensured that the peace it imposed would be fragile, contested, and deeply resented. A peace that existed on paper while beneath it, anger continued to grow, shaping identities, fueling myths, and preparing the ground for a future that many Germans believed could only be reclaimed through defiance and reversal, through the promise that one day the shame of Versailles would be erased and the balance of power would be rewritten by those who had been forced to bow their heads but had never truly accepted the verdict of defeat. The war had ended, but survival itself became a daily struggle for millions, and nowhere was this more visible than in the fragile economies left behind after 1918. Europe was exhausted, its factories damaged, its workforce depleted, and its financial systems tangled in debt. Nations had borrowed heavily to fight the war, and the burden of repayment now sat on societies already drained of strength. In Germany, the situation was especially dire, not only because of physical destruction, but because the economy was tied to the crushing obligations imposed by reparations. What had once been a functioning industrial state was slowly transformed into a nation where money no longer meant security and work no longer guaranteed survival. Hyperinflation did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly at first, then all at once. Prices rose, savings shrank, and trust in the currency dissolved. For ordinary families, the concept of planning for the future disappeared. Paychecks lost value between morning and evening. Housewives rushed to markets with baskets full of banknotes, knowing that Hesida Shan meant hunger. Pensions became meaningless, destroying the lives of elderly citizens who had believed in stability and order all their lives. The sense of betrayal was profound because this was not just economic failure, it was the collapse of an entire social contract. This chaos reshaped how people understood authority. When governments failed to protect livelihoods, people stopped believing in democratic promises. The Weimar Republic, struggling to assert legitimacy, became associated with weakness and incompetence. Parliamentary debates felt distant and irrelevant to men standing in bread lines and families burning furniture to keep warm. Extremist voices, once dismissed as fringe, began to sound convincing simply because they offered certainty. They did not speak in cautious policies or compromise. They spoke in absolutes, in enemies and solutions, in blame and redemption. Across the Atlantic, the illusion of stability shattered in 1929. The collapse of the American stock market triggered a global chain reaction that turned economic fear into worldwide catastrophe. Banks failed, credit vanished, and international trade collapsed. Because Europe depended heavily on American loans and investment, the shockwaves were immediate and brutal. Factories closed almost overnight. Unemployment soared not by thousands but by millions. In Germany, nearly 1 in 3 workers found themselves without jobs, standing idle in a society that had defined dignity through labor. Unemployment was not just the absence of work, it was the erosion of identity. Men who had once been providers now wandered streets feeling useless and ashamed. Families were torn apart by stress and desperation. Children grew up malnourished, watching their parents lose hope. In this environment, fear became a political force. People were no longer asking which party had the best plan. They were asking who could make the pain stop. Economic collapse also sharpened social divisions. The middle class, once the backbone of stability, felt especially betrayed. Their savings had been wiped out by inflation, their status undermined, their faith in gradual progress destroyed. To them, democracy appeared incapable of protecting those who played by the rules. This sense of injustice created fertile ground for radical movements that promised to restore order and punish those blamed for the collapse. Jews, communists, bankers, foreigners, and political opponents were increasingly portrayed as responsible for economic suffering, turning complex financial systems into simple narratives of betrayal. While Germany became the most extreme example, it was not alone. Across Europe, economic hardship destabilized governments and empowered extremist ideologies. In Italy, fear of socialist revolution and economic disorder helped propel Benito Mussolini to power. In Eastern Europe, fragile democracies collapsed into authoritarian rule as leaders promised stability over freedom. Even in Britain and France, fear of economic collapse shaped cautious foreign policies and deepened a desire to avoid another war at any cost. The Great Depression did more than empty pockets. It hollowed out trust. International cooperation, already weak, collapsed as nations turned inward. Countries raised tariffs, restricted trade, and competed aggressively for resources and markets. This economic nationalism intensified global tensions and reinforced the belief that survival depended on strength, not cooperation. For revisionist powers like Germany, this environment confirmed the idea that the post-war order was failing and could be challenged. Radical movements understood the power of economic despair. They organized rallies not just as political events, but as emotional releases. Flags, music, and mass gatherings transformed individual frustration into collective purpose. Leaders spoke of dignity stolen, futures denied, framing economic suffering as a moral injustice that demanded action. In these moments, extremism felt less like an ideology and more like a rescue. As the early 1930s unfolded, The link between economic collapse and political radicalization became undeniable. Each failed government, each austerity measure, each closed factory pushed more people toward parties that rejected compromise entirely. The promise of democracy weakened as hunger grew. Fear made people willing to trade freedom for security, pluralism for certainty. By the time economic conditions began to stabilize in parts of Europe, the damage was already embedded in political culture. Extremist parties had built networks, loyalty, and legitimacy through years of crisis. They had learned how to transform economic pain into political power, how to weaponize resentment and despair. The collapse of economies between 1918 and 1939 did not merely create hardship. It reshaped belief systems, undermined democratic values, and convinced millions that only radical change could restore dignity, turning financial disaster into the emotional engine that drove societies toward authoritarianism and prepared them to accept conflict as a solution rather than a tragedy. He did not arrive as a conqueror at first, nor as a tyrant marching openly toward war. Adolf Hitler emerged from the wreckage of defeat, from beer halls thick with smoke and bitterness, from a society that felt mocked by history and abandoned by those who claimed to lead it. Germany in the early 1920s was not looking for a dictator, it was looking for meaning. Millions felt humiliated by loss, confused by democracy, and furious at a world that seemed to demand obedience while offering no dignity in return. Hitler understood this emotional landscape instinctively. He spoke not to reason, but to wounds. He presented himself as the voice of those wounds. A former soldier who had experienced the trenches, he wrapped his identity in the suffering of the common man. He spoke of betrayal rather than defeat, insisting that Germany had lost the war on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies. This story was simple, emotionally satisfying, and dangerously effective. It transformed shame into anger and redirected it away from military failure and towards scapegoats. In a nation desperate to reclaim pride, the narrative spread quickly, repeated in speeches, pamphlets, and conversations until it felt like truth. Propaganda became his most powerful weapon. Hitler understood that facts mattered less than feelings, that repetition could turn lies into accepted reality. With the help of loyal followers and skilled organizers, his movement created symbols that stirred emotion before thought could intervene. Flags, uniforms, salutes, and songs turned political gatherings into rituals. Crowds no longer felt alone in their suffering. They felt part of something vast and purposeful. The individual dissolved into the mass, and doubt dissolved with it. The broken promises of the Weimar Republic created the opening Hitler needed. Democratic leaders spoke of patience, compromise, and gradual recovery. But for people who were hungry and unemployed, these words felt hollow. Every election seemed to produce instability, every coalition government another sign of paralysis. Hitler exploited this frustration mercilessly. He promised jobs, order, national revival, and an end to humiliation. He did not offer detailed economic plans. He offered certainty. In times of chaos, certainty felt like salvati. He was careful to cloak extremism in legality rather than seizing power outright. He pursued it through elections, presenting himself as a legitimate alternative to failing institutions. Each crisis strengthened his appeal. When banks collapsed and unemployment soared, his speeches grew sharper, his crowds larger. He framed democracy as weakness and dictatorship as strength, freedom as disorder, and obedience as unity. For those exhausted by instability, this vision felt comforting rather than frightening. Once inside the system, he worked relentlessly to dismantle it from within. Alliances were formed not out of loyalty, but out of opportunity. Conservative elites believed they could control him, use his popularity while restraining his ambitions. They underestimated the depth of his support and the precision of his strategy. When he was appointed chancellor in 1933, many saw it as a temporary compromise, a way to stabilize politics. Instead, it marked the beginning of a rapid and deliberate consolidation of power. Fear became a tool of governance almost immediately. The Reichstag Fire provided a moment of crisis that Hitler transformed into justification. Civil liberties were suspended in the name of security. Political opponents were arrested, silenced, or driven underground. Each act of repression was framed as necessary, each abuse of power defended as protection of the nation. Many accepted this logic because it promised safety in a world that felt perpetually on the brink of collapse. Propaganda intensified as control expanded. Newspapers, radio, and film were brought into line, not always through force, but through incentives and pressure. Messages were simplified, repeated, and emotional. Germany was portrayed as a victim rising against injustice, Hitler as a savior restoring honor. Children were taught loyalty before critical thinking, obedience before empathy. The line between state and society blurred as ideology seeped into everyday life, shaping how people spoke, thought, and even dreamed. Broken promises played a central role in maintaining support. Hitler blamed continued hardship on enemies who supposedly blocked national recovery. When goals were not met, new villains were named. This constant redirection prevented accountability and kept anger alive. Successes, whether real or exaggerated, were credited entirely to his leadership. Infrastructure projects, rearmament, and public works were presented as miracles of will rather than policies financed through debt and preparation for war. Humiliation, once imposed from outside, was now weaponized from within. Germans were taught that weakness was shameful, that compassion was softness, that unity required conformity. Those who did not fit the vision of the nation were excluded, dehumanized, and eventually targeted. Many went along not out of hatred, but out of fear or indifference, convinced that loyalty would keep them safe. Silence became complicity, and complicity became normal. What made Hitler's rise especially dangerous was how ordinary it appeared to many at the time. There was no single moment when the nation collectively chose catastrophe. Instead, there were countless small concessions, each justified by necessity or hope. Each step toward authoritarianism was framed as temporary, each violation excused as exceptional. By the time the true cost became clear, resistance felt impossible and dissent suicidal. The rise of Hitler was not an accident of history or the work of a single man alone. It was the result of humiliation left unaddressed, propaganda allowed to flourish, and promises broken so often that truth itself lost credibility. He rose because suffering demanded explanation, because anger sought direction, and because a wounded society embraced a leader who offered pride instead of healing, certainty instead of reflection, and power instead of responsibility. In the years after the Great War, the leaders of Europe carried scars that could not be seen. They had watched a generation vanish into trenches and return as ghosts. Entire towns had been erased, economies shattered, and political systems pushed to the brink of collapse. When the memory of that destruction lingered in every capital, fear became the dominant force shaping decisions. No government wanted to be responsible for unleashing another catastrophe. Peace was not just a policy, it was an obsession, even when preserving it required dangerous compromises. Britain and France. The two powers most capable of resisting German aggression in the 1930s were also the most traumatized by the last war. Their populations demanded stability, recovery, and distance from conflict. Veterans marched in remembrance, not in preparation. Politicians understood that another war would likely destroy their careers and possibly their nations. This fear created an environment where firmness was viewed as recklessness and caution as wisdom. The desire to avoid confrontation at all costs slowly reshaped foreign policy into a pattern of hesitation and retreat. When Adolf Hitler began testing the limits of the post-war order, his actions were deliberate and calculated. Each move was designed to provoke a response without triggering immediate retaliation. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Militarily, Germany was not yet prepared for a major conflict, and Hitler himself later admitted that a firm French response would have forced him to withdraw. Instead, the reaction was silence. British leaders rationalized the move as Germany entering its own backyard. French leaders hesitated, paralyzed by political division and fear of acting alone. The absence of resistance sent a powerful message that treaties could be broken without consequence. Appeasement was not born from sympathy for Nazism, but from exhaustion and calculation. Many believed that the treaty system itself had been too harsh and that allowing Germany limited revisions would stabilize Europe. Hitler was seen by some as a nationalist, correcting injustices rather than a revolutionary bent on domination. Each concession was justified as the final one, the price paid to secure lasting peace. In reality, these concessions strengthened Hitler's position at home and confirmed his belief that the democracies lacked the will to fight. The Anschluss with Austria in 1938 marked another turning point. German troops entered Vienna to cheering crowds, and the Union was presented as the fulfillment of national self-determination. Once again, Britain and France protested but did nothing. The lack of action reinforced the idea that the balance of power was shifting and that resistance would be symbolic at best. Smaller nations watched closely, realizing that international guarantees might not protect them when tested. The crisis over Czechoslovakia exposed the full consequences of appeasement. The Sudetenland, a region with a significant German-speaking population, became the focal point of Hitler's demands. He framed the issue as one of ethnic rights, masking his strategic goal of dismantling a strong and well-armed state. Czechoslovakia had alliances, fortifications, and a capable army, but those alliances proved fragile. In 1938, at the Munich conference, Britain and France agreed to Hitler's demands without Czechoslovak participation. The agreement was celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy, a moment when war had been avoided through negotiation. The celebration was brief. By sacrificing Czechoslovakia's security, the democracies revealed that they were willing to trade the sovereignty of others for their own sense of safety. Hitler gained territory, resources, and strategic advantage without firing a shot. More importantly, he learned that threats worked. Neville Chamberlain's declaration of peace was sincere, but it rested on a misreading of Hitler's ambitions. Appeasement assumed that grievances had limits, that satisfaction would bring restraint. For Hitler, each success only confirmed the necessity of pushing further. Political cowardice did not always look like fear. Often it appeared as pragmatism, as reasoned compromise in a dangerous world. Leaders convinced themselves that their populations were not ready for war, that their militaries were unprepared, that time could be bought through negotiation. Yet time bought without preparation is not a strategy, it is surrender by delay. While Britain and France hesitated, Germany rearmed at a staggering pace, transforming concessions into concrete advantages. The failure to act also undermined the credibility of collective security. The League of Nations, already weakened by the absence of major powers and a lack of enforcement mechanisms, became a symbol of impotence. When Italy invaded Ethiopia and faced only mild sanctions, the lesson was clear. Aggression would not be decisively punished. Revisionist states learned that international law was negotiable, and that force, or the threat of it, could rewrite borders. Appeasement eroded moral clarity. By framing aggression as understandable grievance, leaders blurred the line between victim and aggressor. Each compromise required justifying the abandonment of principles once declared inviolable. Public opinion was guided toward acceptance, taught to see concessions as necessary sacrifices. This gradual normalization of aggression made resistance seem unreasonable, even dangerous. By the time Hitler violated the Munich Agreement and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939, the illusion had shattered. It was no longer possible to argue that his ambitions were limited or defensive. Yet the years of hesitation had already done their damage. Germany was stronger, alliances weaker, and trust in international promises severely diminished. Appeasement had not preserved peace. It had postponed confrontation while ensuring that when it came, it would be far more destructive. A result of choices made by leaders who feared war so deeply that they failed to stop it when it could still have been contained. The world often marks September 1st, 1939, as the beginning, as if history can be neatly pinned to a single date, a single invasion, a single decision. German forces crossed into Poland, bombs fell on cities at dawn, and declarations of war followed, but by then the conflict was already fully formed, its shape molded by decades of unresolved tension and accumulated failure. The violence of 1939 was not a sudden eruption. It was the release of pressure that had been building since the armistice of 1918, a moment when the machinery of destruction finally roared to life after years of being quietly assembled. To see 1939 as the beginning is to ignore how deeply the world had been preparing for war without admitting it. Political leaders spoke the language of peace while approving rearmament budgets. Nations built alliances out of fear rather than trust. Borders were treated as temporary, subject to revision by force or threat. The memory of the last war haunted every decision, but instead of inspiring cooperation, it fostered paralysis and denial. The desire to believe that catastrophe could be avoided through patience allowed dangers to grow unchecked. By the late 1930s, Europe was already divided into camps defined by ideology, ambition, and insecurity. Germany sought to overturn the post-war order and reclaim what it considered stolen honor and territory. Italy pursued its own vision of empire, challenging the balance of power in the Mediterranean and Africa. Japan expanded aggressively in Asia, demonstrating that the collapse of international restraint was not limited to Europe. The world was drifting toward a global conflict long before Poland became its first battlefield. The diplomatic failures of the interwar years created a dangerous illusion that peace could be preserved without justice or enforcement. Treaties existed, but they were selectively applied. Guarantees were issued, but rarely backed by action. Smaller states learned that their survival depended less on law than on the calculations of stronger powers. This erosion of trust meant that when war finally came, it did so in a climate already poisoned by suspicion and fear. For ordinary people, the approach of war felt both distant and inevitable. Newspapers reported crises with alarming regularity, yet daily life continued. Families adapted to shortages, rationing, and uncertainty. Many sensed that something terrible was coming, but lacked the power to alter its course. The normalization of crisis dulled the sense of urgency, making extraordinary events feel routine. Each new violation of international norms was shocking at first, then quickly absorbed into the background noise of a troubled world. When Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, it shocked observers who had believed ideology would prevent such cooperation. In reality, it was the logical outcome of a system where power trumped principle. The agreement cleared the way for the invasion of Poland, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and demonstrating how completely moral considerations had been sidelined. The pact was not a betrayal of peace. It was a confirmation that peace had already been abandoned. The invasion of Poland itself was swift and brutal, but it did not introduce new methods or intentions. Blitzkrieg tactics had been refined, weapons stockpiled, and plans rehearsed. Civilians were targeted not by accident but by design, part of a strategy that viewed terror as a tool of control. The suffering that followed was not the start of a descent into cruelty. It was the continuation of trends that had been visible for years. Britain and France declared war in response, fulfilling promises they had made too late. Their decision acknowledged a reality they had long resisted, that negotiation and concession could not contain expansionist ambition. Yet even this moment carried the weight of earlier hesitation. Military readiness was incomplete, alliances uncertain, strategies defensive. The years lost to appeasement and delay now exacted their price. Understanding 1939 as a consequence rather than a beginning forces a different view of responsibility. It shifts attention away from a single aggressor or moment and toward a broader failure of international order. World War II was made possible by the inability of nations to reconcile justice with peace, by economic systems that bred desperation, and by political cultures that rewarded short-term stability over long-term security. It was enabled by citizens who were exhausted, leaders who were cautious, and institutions that lacked authority. The narrative of a sudden outbreak also obscures the warning signs that history offered so clearly. Rising nationalism, economic collapse, ideological extremism, and the erosion of democratic norms were not hidden forces. They unfolded in plain sight, debated in parliaments and newspapers, visible in the streets of major cities. The tragedy lies not in ignorance, but in the repeated choice to postpone difficult decisions in the hope that problems would resolve themselves. By reframing 1939 as the culmination of a long process, the focus shifts to the years when different choices might have altered the outcome. It highlights how peace requires more than the absence of war, how stability depends on fairness, and how ignoring injustice creates conditions where violence appears inevitable. The road to World War II was paved with compromises made in the name of peace, each one narrowing the range of future options until conflict became not just likely, but unavoidable, a destination reached step by step through fear, denial, and the gradual surrender of responsibility. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.